History as it happens, December 26, 2025. Year in review.
From this moment on, America's decline is over.
Preparations now for a summit between President Trump and Russian President Putin.
While President Trump was rolling out the red carpet for Russia's leader Vladimir Putin, Putin's military was bombing Ukraine.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now.
Benjamin Netanyahu is ordering immediate and powerful strikes on Gaza.
Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and President Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner have been meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel this morning.
I'm here in Hostage Square. The deal has just been approved. That was no surprise.
It was another year of insane politics in the United States as Donald Trump returned to the White House. Wars raged in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, sweeping away thousands of innocent lives. A new pope arrived. Political violence and racial hatred left their marks. And so much else made 2025 an unforgettable year. That is next as we report history as it happens. I'm Martin DeCaro.
We almost can't have a conversation about how unprecedented the things that Trump is doing in terms of violation of civil rights, in terms of establishment of executive authority, in terms of corruption, frankly, knocking down half the White House. There's so many things that we have run out of synonyms for unprecedented, that we have to recognize that as a president, Trump is in a different category.
Well, Happy New Year, and I hope it is a happy one, because the past year has been so distressing. But I really mean that publicly or from a newsworthy point of view, if you know what I mean. Personally, my year did have its ups and downs. My old friend and mentor, Paul McBride, died a couple of months ago. But for the most part, life was good to me in 2025. And I hope you enjoyed your fleeting time on this planet too. I'm talking about what makes life worth living. Art, nature, family and friends, your hobbies, good books, travel, the stuff we usually don't talk about on this podcast. We usually stick to history, politics, war, peace, ideas, and ideology, all the depressing stuff you read in the newspaper. And man, what a year it was. A person wholly unfit to run a lemonade stand, let alone the U.S. government, returned to the White House.
And we will immediately restore the integrity, competency, and loyalty of America's government.
The first year of President Donald Trump's last term was utterly disgusting and shameful, loaded with crime, corruption, and incompetence. Horrendous wars continued in Sudan, Ukraine, and Gaza, although a rather tenuous ceasefire was achieved in the latter, although Israeli forces continue to kill Palestinian civilians. Pope Leo succeeded Pope Francis. Charlie Kirk was assassinated, one of many acts of political or racial violence that tore the social fabric in the United States. Too much happened over the course of the year to include it all in a short podcast. What will be the final new episode of this year? Best of episodes will drop next week. New episodes will resume in January. But before we get to 2026, one more look at 2025. With historians Jeremi Suri and Jeffrey Engel. Jeremi Suri teaches history at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the co-host of This Is Democracy podcast and writes the Democracy of Hope newsletter on Substack. And Jeffrey Engel is the founding director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. Our conversation next. Jeffrey Engel, welcome back, my friend. It has been a bit.
It has, and it's really nice to talk to you again.
Yeah, you've been with me almost since the very beginning. One of the first conversations, actually the first conversation we had back in 2021, was reflecting on the end of the Cold War. I wonder how events of the past 5 years would change what we said then. Maybe I'll go back and listen to that episode.
We all missed the Cold War.
Yes. I'm talking to you here because I'm reluctant to introduce our colleague, our other guest, because you've been so busy, Jeff, I've been stuck talking to Suri by myself. I don't know how many damn times. Hello, Jeremi Suri. Welcome back again.
Well, this will make this a far better
yes.
episode. There's no doubt.
That's true.
I believe that as well, Jeff.
Yes.
You're the Micah Parsons of our episode. We've got you back from ACL.
Blow out my knee? What are you going to do?
I want to point something out to our listeners before they hit stop and listen to something else. That you both, of course, have been on the show many, many times, and you became subscribers this year. So I want to thank you both personally, but also anyone listening who may want to consider doing the same. I'm trying to promote the work of real scholars, bona fide experts for thoughtful historical analysis of what's happening in the world. It's not about the ad-free listening or anything like that, all the other content I offer subscribers, right? I want people to support the work that people like you are doing.
May I jump in on a point there?
Sure.
Because, so many of your listeners are obviously well-versed in history, but some of them, I'm sure, come to this because they want to be well-versed in history. The thing that always amazes me whenever I look at your episodes and see what topics you're doing and then who you have, whenever you announce a topic, I say, boy, the best person in the world is X. And then you have X. Your ability to get the very best person who I want to listen to on each individual issue is astounding and better than any other podcast I know.
Thank you. Well, there are some exceptions. For instance, when Jeremy's here still. Sorry. No, I love you, Jeremi. You were with me also from the beginning. Our first conversation was about Dwight Eisenhower.
I agree with what Jeff said, and I think the world is a better place when people subscribe to more history podcasts because they're better informed. And so I hope they will subscribe to your podcast and then maybe subscribe to mine too, but it's fine if they just subscribe to yours. That's fine.
Listeners should follow your podcast, This is Democracy, and subscribe to your newsletter, as I do, Democracy of Hope on Substack. We have to start with politics. It's another year in review show, the first year of Trump 2.0. So as historians, we'll start with Jeffrey Engel, since he hasn't been here in a bit, and he is the founding director of something called the Center for Presidential History. What matters is what endures out of any presidential administration. But, we're in the middle of this right now. We're in the thick of it. And some folks take the view that Trump's policies or decisions are destructive and will do lasting damage. Maybe others are a little bit more optimistic that they won't. And then there are, of course, his supporters who think what he's doing is great. Where do you fall on that issue as a historian?
We almost can't have a conversation about how unprecedented the things that Trump is doing in terms of violation of civil rights, in terms of establishment of executive authority, in terms of corruption, frankly, knocking down half the White House. There's so many things that, we have run out of synonyms for unprecedented, that we have to recognize that as a president, Trump is in a different category. But the more interesting and important question that you're alluding to is sort of, what does it all mean? I think that Trump is a very dangerous player on the international stage just because the international stage is reaching a very dangerous moment. We are now 85, 90 years from World War II. I'll remind you that 85, 90 years after the Napoleonic Wars was World War I. There's a series of sequences that generationally that suggest that we've forgotten the lessons of what it is that have made us prosperous and safe, more importantly, for the last 80 years. And when you look at what Trump is interested in doing, especially in limiting our alliances with our NATO allies in particular, what he's really doing is saying that the lessons of the last 80 years don't matter. What only matters are the consequences. So he looks at things and says, well, our prosperity is not what it could be. Our power is not what it could be. Those are all disputable points, but let's accept them from the face of it. He misses the fact that, we haven't had a war since this particular international system was set up. We haven't had international conflict. We haven't had a global depression since this international system was set up. So
major power war, another world war.
Thank you for the correction. Yeah. Yes. The kind of thing that shakes up in the international system like a snow globe, and you don't know how it's going to resettle down. The fact that we have a president who is interested in shaking the snow globe at a moment when there's a lot of snow makes me very nervous.
Yeah, I think, Jeff, you're spot on. I was thinking along the same lines. This first year has shown us that Trump will cause disruption at every level. He's been a little more thwarted at home, and that's starting to rise, the resistance to him at home, which, as we know as historians, will tempt him to do more internationally. And he's already been lashing out internationally, and I think what we're seeing in Venezuela, which is not at all what his supporters want. There's no real constituency for war with Venezuela. But as we know, it's tempting for presidents who are thwarted at home, as they often are, to use their far less constrained powers overseas. And I think we'll see that. I wanted to make one other point about what we've learned this year. I think we can put to rest finally what many of us as historians had assumed for a long time, which was that there was some disciplining element of the office of presidency. We saw that to some extent during Trump's first term. He was self-constrained a little bit, or constrained by the office, constrained by even people who were conservatives like Attorney General Bill Barr and others who said, Mr. President, there are things you can't do. There are laws that limit how you can use the Justice Department. Trump has put to rest the presumption that the office would be self-limiting in some way. He has gone beyond and outside of all constraints. When he has been constrained, which he has been quite often, it's not because of the office of the presidency, it's because of other offices, other entities. It's the state of California or the state of Illinois suing him. It is other branches of government sometimes stepping in, finally voting to force the release, and we'll still see if they're released, of the Jeffrey Epstein files. But we are seeing that the office doesn't constrain the individual in the way we thought it had, and I don't know if we'll ever go back on that.
Well, let me just jump in on that really smart point, because it's not just that the office has people that should typically say you can't do that, but he seems to have nobody around him who says you shouldn't do that.
Right.
No, the opposite. They're cheerleading it. They want it.
Yeah. In the news this week, we're recording this on the 18th. In the news this week is President Trump. Someone is, I don't even know the details. Someone in the White House, someone in his orbit has decided to rewrite the biographies of past presidents as their portraits are displayed at the White House. And the ones towards his political enemies are just insulting. And that's just not the way presidents act.
His personal conduct in office is deplorable. But, Jeff, I say that there's nothing truly unprecedented. Trump may be in some ways worse than his predecessors, but take, for instance, the boat strikes, the illegal extrajudicial murders, killings of alleged drug smugglers in the Caribbean. He's building off of something that we have discussed in the past, the imperial presidency. Sure, they're less legal than the drone strikes Obama did, but it's the same premise. Obama abrogated the Bill of Rights by having an American citizen, yes, a dual Yemeni American citizen, assassinated. What I'm trying to say is there are continuities here. We've been moving in a direction of an imperial presidency, and now in the hands of this utterly deplorable, character-free individual, we're seeing the results.
So I'm going to grant your point entirely and say that, yes, there are a lot of consistencies, and it's clearly an evolutionary process of the growth of executive power. And of course, we all know the Supreme Court last year gave basically carte blanche to a president to do anything that he deems to be within his constitutional
That is
purview.
true.
So the boat strikes are similar to drone strikes, are similar to Gulf of Tonkin. Like we can draw these lines, similar, frankly, to Franklin Roosevelt in the Atlantic, putting destroyers in harm's way in late 1941. So I'll grant that point. What I think is unprecedented is, I guess, more on the personal involvement of the president's own wealth and status with the office. Even when one hears your favorite MAGA friend say, "What about Hunter Biden?"
What about him?
Well, if you count up the amount of money that they supposed Hunter Biden stole, it's barely a tip compared to the amount that's already gone out in the coffers of this administration.
Well, the crypto stuff, they legalize this sham crypto business and then make billions off it.
I think there are continuities, of course, but scale matters. Scale matters, right? And the way history generally works is that you follow precedent and you push the precedent a little more, and that would be what we would call a continuity in history. So one could argue that Lyndon Johnson pushes war powers in Vietnam, and then Nixon and Kissinger do a little more, right? And then Reagan does a little more. And that is the growth of the imperial presidency. That would follow what Arthur Schlesinger, one of the first to write about this, would say. But this is not that. This is not just pushing a little more. This is taking that precedent and blowing it up on steroids and every other drug possible, and basically going so far beyond that precedent that it actually destroys the precedent. The notion of the imperial presidency was that the president would work within the law and stretch the law slightly. This is a lawless presidency.
I agree.
And the example of the boats in Venezuela, and how do we know that? How do we know it's a lawless president? Look at the number of established military officers who have resigned because they wouldn't do this. They were not fired. They resigned because they would not do this. The admiral in charge of Southern Command and various others down the line. That's an example of not just continuity. That's an example of blowing the scale.
How long did the nation take to recover from Nixon's lawlessness? Some would say maybe the presidency never truly recovered after the damage Nixon did.
Well, there was a snapback. We can certainly say that we're still living under the shadow of Nixon in certain kinds of ways, and the snapback did not fully succeed. Obviously, the Church Commission and others, or Church Committee and others, didn't actually rein in the intelligence agencies as much as they intended to. But you did see in the early 1970s a brand new Congress that came into office and that used its powers to severely limit what presidents could do. And I would expect to see a Congress try to do the same thing, not just in 2026, but after the 2028 elections as well. There will still be elements of presidential power that a new president, even if of the other party, that president will want to take under his or her control. But you will see Congress get stricter on many issues. For example, I think you will see an effort once again to try to rein in war powers. I think you will see an effort to limit bribes and corruption, emoluments by the executive office. I think you'll see an effort to limit the use of ICE and military force within the United States, because no Republican wants to see a Democrat do that, and no Democrat wants to see another Republican do that.
Jeffrey, how long, I'll ask you the same question. How long did it take the country to recover from Nixon's lawlessness? I mean, the parallel here is the notion that Donald Trump is doing lasting damage, which I agree with in some areas. Nixon did lasting damage, or what was the verdict there?
In terms of the way in which Watergate, coupled with Vietnam, damaged American faith in their government and faith in Washington as an institution, we've never recovered. We have not reached levels yet from pre-Nixon. People are basically saying, yes, if you ask people, do you think the government is out to help you out, is trustworthy, is honest? We've never gotten back to the numbers before Nixon. But I think there's a broader issue here that, in addition to when we ask, matters of scale, as you just did, I find myself wondering, especially with Venezuela, which I think is actually the issue that in the new year is going to be the most troublesome for the Trump administration, because that clearly is the area, I think, where Congress both recognizes that A, this is clearly wrong, and B, it's, by the way, something in the Constitution says we're supposed to do something about that. You think back on our previous examples that we just used of presidents using executive authority to increase military affairs without congressional approval. Roosevelt did that, and the threat was Nazi Germany. Truman did it, and the threat was North Korea and China. Johnson did it, and the threat was the Cold War. I've not been impressed. I've seen anyone make an impressive case for why Venezuela is actually a national security threat.
Well, of course it isn't.
And making the argument that fentanyl is a weapon of mass destruction is too cute by half, not least because we all know fentanyl doesn't come from Venezuela.
Well, the New York Times has just done some reporting that it really is about the oil, apparently. But go ahead, yeah.
My point being that when we look back on those previous examples, we can at least say we have a president who is dealing with a really difficult foreign policy crisis and chooses to escalate militarily. This strikes me thus far, at least, as a president who is choosing to embed himself in a difficult military crisis. And I can't figure out why.
And if I could just build on that briefly, I think he is also widely miscalculating because he's underestimating Venezuela. There's nothing good to be said about Maduro and that regime in Venezuela. Maduro does know how to stay in power, and as everyone knows, the Venezuelans are now going to be putting convoys around their tankers. So are we going to get into a naval sea battle with the Venezuelan Navy when 25% of our Navy is there in that region, and we have so many other needs for our Navy? And even if we do, how are we going to dislodge Maduro?
That's what I can't figure out.
Are we preparing a land invasion of some kind? And by the way, Trump's supporters are the ones who are least interested in foreign military operations with American soldiers. So I don't actually understand what the end game is here at all.
It makes me chuckle every morning when I listen to the early morning news and they say, well, perhaps Trump is planning an invasion. Our 15,000 troops, which is the number of soldiers that we have, not sailors, soldiers that we have, are 15,000 troops enough to take over Venezuela? I'm thinking 15,000 troops aren't enough to take over Austin.
I just did a show with the great Frederick Logoval, and we were talking about Robert McNamara and the importance of top officials resigning in protest when they are given illegal, immoral, whatever tasks, right? You're not going to get that out of Hegseth. He's nuts. These people, they're deranged. The president gave an address, a primetime speech, 20 minutes, where he's telling people everything is so great. Oh, but also it's going to be even better next year. And the problems you're having aren't real, but maybe they are real because I'm here telling you how great things are. This is a man who's detached from reality. And, I'll just, before we move on to some other subjects, because we just can't talk politics, there's other stuff happened this year. Francis Fukuyama, writing for Persuasion on Substack, says Donald Trump's second term was always expected to be bad, but his actions have been so much worse than even last year's pessimists and I include myself in that group, imagined. Domestically, he's hollowed out the Justice Department and turned it into an instrument of personal revenge. With ICE, he is in the process of creating the country's largest law enforcement agency, loyal primarily to himself rather than to the law, whose agents have gone after law-abiding migrants and swept up citizens with no due process. I'll just insert here that this year began with the administration arresting foreign-born students who criticized Israel. Fukuyama goes on to say, he has put a charlatan in charge of America's public health and has indiscriminately fired civil servants and closed entire agencies in ways that'll undermine government capacity for years to come. Years to come. It's possible that there will be lasting damage, but presidents come and go. We're in the thick of it now. It's hard to say. Policies can be overturned, right? Jeremi, you were discussing that about what might happen next with a different Congress. But what really I think is going to last is what this man and his followers, his most ardent followers, have done to our country. I think a segue into a broader look at this beyond politics, our society. Look what happens when someone popular, somebody prominent, has been killed or has died, right? Everyone jumps into like this tribal spat. That guy's a son of a bitch, and your side says bad things about our people when they die.
I think we need to be careful about taking that too far. I think there's a point in what you're saying. But,
I mean, social media is a big part of this, too.
But I also think there's a way in which this has gone so far that it's disgusted everyone and people are looking for something different, too. I mean, maybe it's a blessing that this has been so obviously bad in that it's very hard to justify it going forward and people look in different directions. I mean, I see evidence, even among my Republican friends, of a real rethinking about what our country should look like. I think they've stared into the abyss. It doesn't mean that they're fully, free of the limitations, nor does it mean that we don't have some of these problems on the left as well.
Of course.
But I do think people have stared into the abyss and said, this is not the country we want. And it's very hard to justify Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Secretary of Health and Human Services, just as Jeff was saying so well before. It's very hard to justify Pete Hegseth. I will tell you, I have hundreds of private conversations with military officers, over the months, and not a single one, even the most conservative ones, the ones who hated Obama, not a single one will say anything nice about this SecDef. They just hope they don't have to have any interaction with him until he is gone.
But he should be out already. That's the thing. No one has resigned. No one's been fired.
But it's delegitimized itself. But I think the biggest loss, the biggest enduring loss for the United States is international. Coming out of World War II and out of the Cold War, we made a lot of mistakes. But there was also a lot of goodwill toward the United States, especially in regions of the world that matter a lot to us, in Europe, in Japan, elsewhere. And I have witnessed myself, I'm sure Jeff has too, not only the diminishment of that goodwill, but a real questioning of whether it can ever come back again. It's sort of like we were the flawed sibling or flawed parent. But we had mistakes, but we were still a good parent, or we were still a good sibling. And now we've crossed a line. It's going to be hard to convince people to trust us again. I heard this repeatedly from pro-American Germans. I've heard this from pro-American people in Japan. And we benefited so much. The world, I believe, benefited so much from that. And I don't think we'll ever get it back.
Let me give a concrete example on that, because it's what really worries me. I've been trying to think of ways to demonstrate exactly what Jeremi is saying, because trust is not something you can put a number on. How do we empirically say that America's reputation declining is going to be detrimental? And I think science and technology is the place to look. I don't think any of us on our 2025 bingo cards had the United States government would stop funding cancer research. Any research, really, because there may be a DEI hire somewhere in a university. What I think we need to appreciate is that one of the ways in which the international system coalesced into stability after World War II was an acceptance that American standards were the world standards and could be trusted. There's a reason why every flight in the world is conducted in English, because that's the standard. That's what people want to use. If the CDC says something, the rest of the world believes it. Maybe Robert Kennedy doesn't, but the rest of the world does. Not perfect, but the best available information out there. And I don't know who the world turns to at this point to say this is a useful piece of information. I mean, how many countries around the world, many countries around the world, basically have ceded their drug research, as one example, to the United States. If a drug is safe for Americans to have, it's safe for their own people to have. Well, what do we do in a world where that's no longer
Well,
the case?
Beijing will try to fill that gap.
Well, but I personally don't take a lot of drugs that are produced in China that I know of.
No, I mean, as far as like research,
want
though, we have all these great researchers come to our universities. That may stop if we're not going to allow migrants in. They'll go to universities in China. I don't know. I really don't know.
The United States created a set of global standards that people didn't always like that we got to do that. But those standards were respected for that reason. Without standards, I think this is Jeff's point, how do we function as a world? And it makes it easier for charlatans and villains in all parts of the world to corrupt things when we don't have a gold standard of one kind or another, figuratively.
And I'll just add that in that piece I mentioned from Fukuyama, he argues that the age of Trump is now starting to decline, that he reached the peak of his power, if you will, in this first year, and now it'll ebb. We'll see. Only fools try to predict the future.
Fools or political scientists.
That's right. We don't need any of them. That's why I like historians better. One other historical analogy here. There's a reason why Jefferson Davis was banned from ever holding federal office again. After the Civil War, we had our opportunity to banish Trump from political life after Jan 6. And Jeremi, you said your conservative friends, that's it. They've had it. Well, where were they after January 6th?
I agree with you. I agree 100%. I think Jeff and I will probably write this history about the moment that was really missed was the vote on conviction after the impeachment following January 6th, and they had him dead to rights, and they had the votes. McConnell and Cornyn and other senators were going to vote to convict him, and then they decided at the last minute they didn't want to take the heat from their own primary voters, and they thought that the legal system, they thought Jack Smith would take care of him, and they were too cowardly. But finally, some people are standing up to him, and they're exposing that he doesn't actually have the power in their primaries. Mike Lawler and others are saying, look, in order to win our primaries, in order to win our seats, we have to defy the president. And so that has changed. And November 2025 showed that. It's terrible that there was so much cowardice, there's no other way to put it, among leading established Republicans in 2021. And that got us into this mess.
Thinking as a epistemological scholar of history, maybe one of the problems, I think, when we look back is that, yes, I will agree, looking back, there was a lack of courage in the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump. But I also think it's an interesting thing for us historians to think about, because the presumption was we don't need to vote to impeach Trump because there's no way. Everybody, look around you. Everybody knows this man just did this terrible thing. Everybody understands, including his own political allies, and how easy it is over time to rewrite history so that what everybody knew on January 8th, if you keep saying over and over and over again, it's not true, it's not true, it's not true, it's not true, by the end of 2020 and then the end of 2021, increasing numbers of Americans didn't believe what they had actually experienced was true.
I think we're going to have to unpack that as historians. It's a great point. I'm just not sure people changed their views or just decided they didn't care.
So, Jeremi, an issue you've been writing about recently is violence. This year began violently on January 1st, actually. A 42-year-old American Army veteran plowed his truck in a New Year's Eve celebration on Bourbon Street in New Orleans, plowed it into a crowd of people. 14 died, dozens were injured. The driver was killed in a shootout with police. There's been so much violence this year. Of course, that's not new, although there have been times in our country's recent history where there are fewer shootings, fewer mass shootings, lower crime, although the crime rate is pretty low. Why does it seem like it's just so bad right now?
As I've been writing about this, I think we can see as historians that there are moments when there are increases in political violence. It's not necessarily total violence. Actually, in some ways, our cities...
That's a good point. We should talk about political violence, yes.
Yeah. So in some ways, our cities, most cities in the U.S. actually are safer than they've been any time in our lifetime. But there still is a rise in political violence and other kinds of violence, too. There's a rise in gang violence and things of that sort. And the rise in political violence, I think, across the world generally overlaps with moments when there's more violent language in our politics. And I think it's not that you can blame the person for using the violent words for the violence that then follows. There's not a one-to-one correspondence. But the prevalence of violent language, saying that you want to see your enemies dead, saying that your enemies deserve to die, it legitimizes that in the minds of people who are angry and looking to lash out for whatever reason. It puts that in a place where it seems a legitimate, even a favorable thing to do. And I think that's the space that we're in now. It's not unique to this moment. We've had other moments like this. The late 19th century was certainly one of these moments around the world.
There was violence in the 1790s, too, at a time when the Republicans and the Federalists were talking about each other in existential terms.
True. Yeah. And then, of course, the late 60s and early 1970s. So it's not unique to this moment. That's why we should learn this lesson. One of the jobs all of us have, but particularly elected officials, but also for academics, is to discourage the legitimization of violence. We've gone in the opposite direction. And I fear that the reaction to violence on one side is often to justify it on the next. And that's why one of the lessons of historical scholarship, I think, is that there is a real purpose in a violent moment of arguing for nonviolence. That's not an argument against self-defense, but it's an argument that this kind of violent language and violent behavior is not acceptable and is illegitimate, even when it's done by people who are doing it for a cause we might agree in.
Jeremy, something else happens too after, like a spectacular act of violence. When I say spectacular, not in a positive way. It's on our phones, it's major news, it's all over the world, people are looking at it. It is then used to silence legitimate criticism of, say, a country like Israel for its conduct in Gaza. We see that as well. And I know this is tricky because, we can transition to talk about, another major event of 2025 in our year in review here, the ceasefire, which is not a ceasefire, but the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The denunciations of Israel, I often disagree with what pro-Palestinian protesters say. I don't always approve of their tactics, not that they care what I think. But at the same time, there would be no protests if there were no war. It's a tough line to walk is what I'm trying to say. When does criticism, legitimate criticism, cross over into legitimizing violence?
This is actually kind of my point.
Yeah.
It is hard, and we have forgotten that distinction. It is perfectly, I want to talk about Charlie Kirk in this context. I think it might be a better example. There is no justification for the violence, but that doesn't mean that the person who has been illegitimately and horribly assassinated in immoral ways, that person now should be made into a God figure, and that person is free of being criticized. We can criticize the substance of what people do without justifying violence against them. The same for the supporters of Charlie Kirk. They should not be criticized in ways that encourage violence. And I think we've lost that skill set. It is difficult, Martin, but it's actually essential to democratic lowercase d discourse.
Yeah, I don't believe
to be able to do that.
I don't believe in any rule that you can't speak ill of the dead. Maybe you can exercise tact and maybe wait 24 hours. When Joseph Stalin died, did anyone say you can't call him a bastard? He's dead,
Well,
right?
Khrushchev said that.
Khrushchev. No, the Stalin and Hitler comparisons are not great because there's only two people like them, Stalin and Hitler. But, like Rob Reiner, right? I think it's fair to criticize his politics.
Sure.
He was a political activist. It's okay to criticize his politics. It's not okay to say he was murdered because he doesn't like me, which is what Donald Trump said. Jeffrey, we've left you out. Go ahead.
No, but this is a moment where I think one of the biggest questions that we've all been wrestling with, not just this last year, but for the last 10 years, maybe 20 years, maybe it goes back to your Watergate point and Nixon. How strong are our actual institutions, the things that we can't measure, the things that that democracy relies upon because we all agree upon it? And this is actually a place where I'm optimistic. The fact that people are appalled by the relatively still few number of violent acts, political acts in our country, and that we're still appalled by them is a good thing. I am frankly shocked and surprised that there isn't more political violence. The institutions, I think, we're stressed, obviously, but the basic institution that we are supposed to have, basic human decency, is, I think, still... Though I would say it's not getting a lot of help from the top.
That's actually super helpful because I don't think that we've become a more violent people. In fact, probably less so. I think your kids, Jeff, and my kids are less violent than our generation was. I think there's actually less interpersonal violence. I grew up in an environment in public schools in New York City where it was okay to get into fistfights. That was acceptable. It's not acceptable now. Right? You're not a cool kid if you're getting into fistfights in most environments, right? So the world has changed in that sense. I think what's different is that there's more legitimacy now for political violence than there was 10, 20 years ago, maybe not more than 30, 40 years ago. I think about also another event that happened this year, the attack on the insurance executive. by Luigi Mangione, right? Do I have his name right?
Yes, Mangione, yes.
Mangione. Again, there's always been this strange way in which an assassin has a following and is made into a martyr and a hero, just as he has been a little bit. But the ways in which there is a sort of discussion about, well, maybe violence in this context is justified, and the ways in which some people are apologizing for that. I think it's not creating more general violence interpersonally at the restaurant, but it is creating a space where more people come to think that violence is appropriate when we have major political differences. And I think that's a problem right now. And that does come from the top.
Yeah.
There's violence and there's violence. So as you and Jeremy both know, and now the audience will, my son is spending the year studying in Jerusalem. And any number of people have come up to me and said, my goodness, how can you stomach sending him to a war zone? Aren't you scared? And I say, statistically speaking, he's much, much more likely to die in Dallas of violence than in Jerusalem. We're a very violent society.
Yeah, well, he's in Jerusalem, not Gaza. A segue to my next question. Do you feel that we're seeing a historic shift? I think polls would actually back this up. The American public, not the government, the American public support for Israel because of Israel's conduct, which now I describe as genocidal conduct. Israel's conduct in Gaza and the West Bank. American public opinion has soured on support for Israel. I mean, I don't think we've ever seen it this bad since 1948. Do you think we're seeing a sea change here?
I think we're seeing a change among young Americans, yeah, and maybe a change in the other direction, or at least less change among older Americans. But I think a young generation of Americans, Jewish and non-Jewish, is a little more skeptical of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, is perhaps, I don't want to say more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, but sees that side as the underdog. I mean, one of the things that has changed is, again, when the three of us were growing up, Israel was the underdog. It was perceived that way. Whether it was or not, we can argue. But It was perceived as the underdog. And it was perceived, for those of us who are Jewish, Jeff and myself, right, it was also perceived as a kind of salvation, as a sort of a way, something that had been created because we had been, as Jews, the underdogs and the victims for so long. There's still that there. That's still true in some respects, but it's not perceived that way. And I think the perception of Israel now as the stronger actor, as sometimes the bully, it makes it harder to justify, and it creates almost an initial urge to argue the other way. And then there are a lot of young American Jews who do not identify, in particular, with some of the changes that have happened in Israel in the last 2 decades, the movement to the political right, the dominance of Orthodox and other groups. That has, I think, had a big effect on young Americans. I'm not sure it's that different for older Americans.
And maybe it'll recover, but this is directly a result of Israel's conduct in the war, not what Hillary Clinton said, that young people are simply watching too many videos on TikTok.
Smart, well-educated young people from our own country, from around the world, where were they getting their information? They were getting their information from social media, particularly TikTok. That is where they were learning about what happened on October 7th, what happened in the days, weeks, and months to follow. That's a serious problem. It's a serious problem for democracy, whether it's Israel or the United States, and it's a serious problem for our young people.
Well, what are they looking at? Looking at Palestinian children with their heads, arms, and legs blown off with American munitions. And this is the one issue where listeners can probably detect my temper. I start to lose my normally calm temperament because it's a disgrace. $3 billion a year to Israel for what it has done in military aid. $3 billion.
$4 billion.
$4 billion, yes, for what it has done in Gaza.
One of the things, Martin, which I think I struggle with, and I would ask you to consider, while granting that the Israelis have been hardly ideal, less than perfect, immoral in many ways, the fact that anti-Semitism also is a prevalent feature of global society for the last 500 years is essentially saying that, yes, the Israelis are doing something, but it's animating a button that already exists. It's animating animosity that already exists. So I have a really difficult time, to go back to your question, how Americans perceive Israel. I have a really difficult time understanding what part of that is Israel and what part of that is anti-Semitism. Because I'll make up an example, if New Zealand did the same thing, there's not 500 years of anti-New Zealand sentiment, 5,000 years of anti-New Zealand sentiment that people can draw upon. And so when I see a rally against Israel, I don't know how much of that is legitimate, in my opinion, frustration with Israeli policy, and how much of that is just like, oh yeah, I've been told my whole life I'm supposed to hate the Jews, so I'll mention that.
All right, among the really ardent pro-Palestinian protesters, are there some knee-jerk anti-Semites who will jump at any opportunity? Sure. But there's a lot of gray area here. Opinion has changed, which indicates that it is an anti-Semitism, that people who used to support Israel and would probably continue to support Israel have no anti-Semitic feelings at all, are just simply appalled at what they're looking at in Gaza, which was enabled not by Trump, enabled by Joseph Biden. So
I think both of these things are true. We have seen in the last year, this is a year in review, right? We have actually seen, I think, rising anti-Semitism. And we have also seen legitimate rising criticism of Israel, both within the American public. And I think Jeff is absolutely right. It's sometimes hard to disentangle those two things, but they are different, right? So there are a lot of critics of Israel who are not anti-Semitic. And there are a lot of critics of Israel who are anti-Semitic. And that's why we as historians avoid these sort of simple categories.
Yes.
But there's no doubt that we as Jews face more anti-Semitism today. But there's also no doubt that Israel has pursued policies that have made it harder for us to justify support for Israel than before also.
When Italy does something bad, Catholic churches around America don't have to put up barriers.
the issue here, Jeff, is that Israel is an explicitly Jewish state. It's an ethno state where the Arabs in Israel, the Palestinian Arabs, don't have the same rights as Jews. It's a Jewish supremacist state, explicitly.
This is actually one of the big failures of Netanyahu, and
Yes.
It's part of this year in review, right? Because what you just said was not always true. The beauty of Israel as an idea, it was to be a home for Jews, but it was not to only be a home for Jews. And Netanyahu, kind of copying Modi in India, and they're sort of going off of each other, have tried to turn their democracies into much more ethno-states. And that's one of the challenges, and I think that then redounds into the United States in making it harder, especially for those of us who might be Jewish but don't only define ourselves that way, to justify this. I would also say that to my reading of it, Israel's vibrance and dynamism has been in part because it was a Jewish state, but in part because it was cosmopolitan and not just a Jewish ethno-state. And go to Tel Aviv and you see that. It's one of the most dynamic cities in the world because it is filled with so many people from different kinds of backgrounds, Jewish and non-Jewish.
Yeah, I mean, to me, one of the many tragedies here is that what Israel is doing is not in Israel's interests. When I say Israel, the government of Netanyahu and the religious and nationalist maniacs on his right. This is bad for Israel's survival as a democracy. It isn't a liberal democracy.
Totally agree.
We've got to wrap up. I mean, Russia, Ukraine. I want to talk about
but Russia, Ukraine.
I mean, that's a huge story that has receded somewhat, but it's still popping into the front page here and there. This was supposed to end 24 hours after.
I was under the impression the president solved that.
Yes, right.
One of the 8 wars he's solved.
Yeah, we don't have time to get into the entire year of the diplomatic back and forth, which has often been embarrassing, not very effective. It seems there have been times where it appeared, that was a very lawyerly construction, it seems there have been times when it appeared that maybe a deal was on the table that could bring this to a close. I don't see that. This is a year in review, but maybe I'm going to ask you to prognosticate here. I mean, where is all this going?
A long war of attrition that is nowhere near its end. One of the things we know as historians is that starting wars is much easier than ending wars. I see no sign, despite what Trump and others have said, I see no sign that Vladimir Putin is willing to accept any kind of compromise that would provide for a secure Ukraine, even if he were given territory. Recognize what Zelensky has said repeatedly, that Ukraine cannot agree to a ceasefire, a long-term ceasefire, that allows Russia to just, regroup and attack again. They need some kind of security guarantee. I see no evidence that the United States is going to provide a credible security guarantee of our own forces for Ukraine. I see no evidence that Putin will be able to conquer all of Ukraine. Ukraine will continue to resist. I see no evidence that Ukraine is ready to push all of Russia out of Ukraine. So, welcome to World War I in the 21st century. That's where we are.
Jeff, one of the strengths of your terrific book about George H.W. Bush is you show how careful that amazing team of diplomatic people he had around him, how carefully they handled the thorniest of problems in the world during his one term in office, including, the end of the Cold War. How would you compare that diplomacy to what we're seeing from Witkoff and the other amateurs? Jeremy's laughing.
He is actually. I think you used the right word, amateur. And again, I go back to where I started, that One of the things that frightens me is when people get involved in things that they don't know what the downsides are and the consequences because they're just ignorant. This, I think, we're seeing in amateur diplomacy, yes, also in amateur business, also in, there's a reason that I don't actually perform surgery, even though I'm a doctor. I know my limits. But the broader context, I think, of what's going on in Ukraine right now in the first year of the second Trump administration is, I think, bigger than what's going on in Ukraine. The broader context is, I think, that the rest of Europe has decided quite clearly that the United States is no longer a trustworthy ally.
Predictability is gone.
Yeah, and Europe is perplexed that their ally for the last 75 years seems unimpressed by the fact that there is a hostile force attacking Europe. So, and the Biden administration, at least, they had all kinds of issues about how much to fund Ukraine, how much to support Ukraine when, and what was too much, what was too little. Tricky policy problem. But you knew which side they stood on.
Yeah, I mean, let's remember, Trump started the year by taking Russia's side as far as who started the war. He publicly suggested at a news conference that Ukraine started the war. I think he's pulled back on that. All right, we got to wrap up, but it's been a terrible year for my industry, journalism, and I'm not even referring to Olivia Nutzy or Nutzy, pun intended. Do you guys follow that at all? Yes or no? We don't have to talk about it. That's more like a Washington journalism thing. Never mind.
A little bit.
Yeah, good. Yeah, you're better not to pay attention. It's been a terrible year for journalism. In some ways, there's no absolutes in this world. Sports, personally, Jets fan here, not a good year. I know Engel is a Jets fan. Jeremi, Suri, we did see something historic in the NFL. I know you're a big NFL fan. You're a Packers fan. The end of the Chiefs dynasty.
Yes, I would say now the rise of the Packers.
We'll let's not get
without Micah Parsons. As a New York fan, though, too, I'm a Knicks fan, having grown up in New York. It is really nice to see a competitive Knicks team. They are not the best team in the NBA, and they're probably not going to win the championship, but they did win the NBA Cup. The world does seem a little more in order when New York City at least has a decent basketball team. The last 2 years we've now had one, and it's been a long time in coming.
Well, we're all about the same age, and I consider myself an amateur NFL historian. More like I just have a really good memory for this
You're
stuff.
A far better historian of other things.
Yeah, so I'm not a historian at all. I do like studying or just absorbing the knowledge about NFL history and the ebb and flow of great franchises. And we're all about the same age, so we remember Montana and the 49ers, and then Aikman and the Cowboys in the 90s. The Patriots had basically two dynasties that covered 6 Super Bowls over 20 years, 3 and 3. And now this dynasty is over, although Mahomes will still be around. You guys look really interested in listening to what I'm saying right now.
As Jets fans, I'm all of us.
What playoffs? What's that?
Well, yeah, you're saying
you're the only two left. I think
you're saying there's an ebb and flow suggests two-way direction. I mean, come on. When do we get some ebb? I'd like some ebb, please.
A couple of Jews and an atheist walk into a podcast, and now they're talking about the Jets.
The real issue to look at, by the way, is how, in the same way that our country has decided that scientific research is unimportant, our universities have decided that academics is not as important as other things. The fact that NIL money, that you can, a backup cornerback for a Division I team in a Big 5 conference gets paid more than a full professor.
Oh my God.
Should really disturb most people who care about the long-term prognosis for American strength on the world stage.
Is it true that reading is declining among college students? They can't read anymore. True or false?
False for my students, but I don't know how representative.
This is a big story I see on Substack a lot.
They can, but they don't like it.
But they will. If they're forced to, they will, and then they'll learn to. They will find it's not as bad as they thought it was.
I don't know what to make of all these stories I see about the death of reading. So I thought I would ask you guys, since you're in the classroom.
I'm more concerned about the death of writing.
Well, yeah. I mean, AI, right? You guys get AI papers. What do you do with it when you know it's...
What papers do we not have that are AI?
So what do you do with it?
We don't know yet. We don't know
I make them rewrite it if I can catch it. I don't always catch it, but I make them rewrite it. But they have to learn to write, and I agree with Jeff. If you can't write clearly, you can't think clearly.
No, I mean, the implications are horrendous for our society if you can't put words on a piece of paper as an educated person. Did you guys know I'm an AI?
You're a bot?
I'm an AI.
I just knew you were a villain.
Yeah, exactly. All right, favorite books and movies of 2025. We'll end on a somewhat positive note. Jeremi, why don't you go first?
Okay, so I really liked the Bob Dylan film, I have to admit. I think Timothée Chalamet did a really good job. I know it was at the beginning of the year, but I think it was what it was called, A Complete Unknown, I think. That has stuck with me. I've actually encouraged other people to watch it. So that's my film. And then there's so many books. The one that I think I'll name just because it's on the tip of my tongue right now, Michael Vornberg, historian actually at Brown University.
I did a show with him about that book. Go ahead.
Lincoln's Peace. which is really just a beautiful book on the challenges of ending a war, of ending the Civil War. And as you read that book, you can think about Ukraine and so many other wars. It's just a beautiful book that I recommend to people.
I've actually been going back and reading some books that we don't read anymore and finding just how beautiful and impressive they are. I've been reading a lot of Walter Lippmann lately, obviously a brilliant writer. But also, I just reread for my own research James McGregor Burns's Fox and the Lion, which is about first volume of his 2-volume biography of Franklin Roosevelt. Yeah, there's a lot he didn't know because it came out in 1954, but it is just so beautifully written and, more importantly, perceptive because, again, to go back to my earlier point about January 6th, there is something to be said as historians. We acknowledge that hindsight gives us advantages, but also being there in the moment gives you advantages. Burns has a lot of brilliant insights where you just know that this is because he's been thinking about this man he's been watching for 20 years. In terms of movies, I'll go with a television show. I really like Slow Horses.
Best book I read this year, maybe the most thought-provoking, was Dirk Moses, The Problems of Genocide. Although I think I may have finished that at the end of last year, so I got to come up with something else here. I read Kai Bird's book, The Good Spy About Robert Ames. What a book. And also Dan Efron's Killing a King. I just read those books, and I had both authors on the podcast fairly recently. Both were really eye-opening. I learned a lot. Anytime I can read a book and learn a lot, right, I feel like it's a worthwhile endeavor, although any reading is positive. My favorite movie of the year, nothing new. I think the best movies of the year I watched were old movies that I watched again, and there's too many of those to name. So, fellas, thanks again for another fantastic year. I'll talk to you both in 2026. And that is a wrap on new episodes for 2025. Thank you for sticking with me through another year. And if you haven't become a subscriber already, go to historyasithappens.com. For $5 a month, you can support the important work we're doing here. You'll get ad-free listening, bonus content, and 24/7 access to the entire catalog of more than 500 episodes. historyasithappens.com. And I'll talk to you all in 2026.